Hi, I'm Jessica B. Weisenfels. Welcome to my online graduation lecture. You can always count on a narrator for a fancy prose style, finding a voice for your compelling character. Lolita, light of my life, fire of my loins, my sin, my soul. Lolita, the tip of the tongue taking a trip of 3 steps down the palate to tap at 3 on the teeth. Lolita. She was low, plain low in the morning, standing 4 feet 10 in one sock. She was Lola in slacks. She was Dolly at school. She was Dolores on the dotted line. But in my arms she was always Lolita. Did she have a precursor? She did. Indeed she did. In point of fact, there might have been no Lolita at all had I not loved, one summer, an initial girl child, in a Princeton by the sea. Oh, when? About as many years before Lolita was born as my age was that summer. You can always count on a murderer for a fancy prose style. As far as narrators go, Humbert Humbert is both intrusive and unreliable, and the story he tells is at times sickening, so why do people read the whole book? While I hope we can all agree that Humbert Humbert of Nabokov's Lolita is not a person whose moral code should be followed, he is a character that people can follow through the pages of the book. This is primarily because Nabokov has created a compelling voice that propels the reader through the story. But we're not here to spend all our time on the subject of arguably one of the most controversial books in recent memory. Today we're talking about the big, much discussed problem of voice. Though we will touch on the topic of finding your own unique voice, we're going to narrow the unwieldy breadth of the subject a bit by focusing on how to create a strong voice for first-person narrators. We're going to discuss what writers can do to give narrators distinct voices that readers can follow through the narrative, looking largely at essays from a book called Writing Voice, The Complete Guide to Creating a Presence on the Page and Engaging Readers, which was put together and published by the folks over at Writer's Digest. Let's begin our discussion by pinning down exactly what voice is. Here we're going to consult the extraordinarily useful essays in Writing Voice. In his essay from the book, called Creating Your Own Voice, Don Fry says, "Voice is a collection of devices used consistently to create the illusion of a person speaking through the text." Later, he will also point out that voice differs from tone, the emotional cast. The same voice can sound elated or sad, even in the same text. Stephen Harper, in his essay, The Voice of Genre, says, "Style is related to voice. Voice goes deeper. Voice is also the persona you put on when you start writing." Gabriela Pereira, in her essay, Creating a Narratorial Voice, says, "Voice is the sound and tone of your story. It's the piece of you that goes into everything you write. It's your literary fingerprint, your signature style, and it develops over time." In fact, nearly every contributor in the Writing Voice book has her or his own take on what voice means. Voice as device, voice as persona, voice as fingerprint, and so on. What all of the essays in the book have in common is the premise that voice is very important. So let's dive straight into some advice from our fellow writers, shall we? We're going to talk about some methods you can use to try to work out a voice for your character that is both unique and exceptional. Number 1, know thyself. First, we're going to talk about tapping into your own voice. Perhaps it will seem counterintuitive to talk about personal voice when the purpose of this lecture is to discuss creating a voice for a character, but if you'll bear with me, we'll get to the intersection of those two processes. Anne Lamott's book on writing, Bird by Bird, is likely to have been one of the first texts recommended to you when you were a beginning writer. It's chock full of great advice, and Lamott has some things to say about voice, too. In the chapter Finding Your Voice, Lamott offers the perspective of a writing teacher on what she sees most often in her classes when her students are first dipping their toes into the deep waters of voice. One paragraph is particularly useful to our endeavor in this lecture. "We write to expose the unexposed. If there is one door in the castle that you have been told not to go through, you must. Otherwise, you'll just be rearranging furniture in rooms you've already been in. Most human beings are dedicated to keeping that one door shut, but the writer's job is to see what's behind it, to see the bleak, unspeakable stuff, and to turn the unspeakable into words. Not just any words, but if we can, into rhythm and blues. Later on the same page, Lamott says, "I think that most of your characters believe, as children believe, that if the truth were known, they would be seen as good people. Truth seems to want expression. Unacknowledged truth saps your energy and keeps you and your characters wired and delusional. But when you open the closet door and let what was inside out, you can get a rush of liberation and even joy." I don't believe that Anne Lamott expects you to explore every unexplored corner of your very soul before you write a word. But there is something to the idea that writers should at least have a cursory experience with their own darkness before they try to create complex characters. After all, a writer who has not looked behind their own locked doors may have trouble peeking behind the locked doors of the narrator they're writing. So though you can't be expected to explore the unexplored parts of yourself through all of your characters, it might be a good idea to spend some time thinking about what you'd rather not discuss, and why. If Lamott is correct, and in my experience she usually is, one of the keys to voice is to explore what is personal, the unacknowledged truth of the writer. There is something we need to address before we go any further. Is finding your voice an accurate way to talk about what we're trying to get at here? Gabriela Pereira's essay in Writing Voice makes a different claim. She says, "Finding your voice has become a writing instruction cliché, second only to kill your darlings and show, don't tell. But it turns out that this is bad advice. Finding your voice implies that your voice is missing, and that to improve your writing you must insert more voice into it. Nonsense. You already have a voice, and it's present in everything you write. It might not be obvious, it might be almost invisible, but it's there. The key is to shape it with intention." It seems then that the ancient advice written on Apollo's temple at Delphi is especially important for writers. Know thyself. In knowing your darkness, your own manners of speech, and finding your own voice on the page, by exploring what's behind what Lamott calls your locked doors, you can begin to think about what is behind your character's locked doors as well. You already have a voice, a manner of speaking and writing, a personal lexicon of word knowledge built from a lifetime of experience, devices you prefer to use when you write or speak. The key is to shape that voice with intention, and from there, maybe, just maybe, you can create a narrator with a voice unlike any other. Number 2, know thy character. Now that we've got all that messy thinking about our own inner darkness stuff out of the way, we're going to talk about shaping characters before the actual process of writing those characters down begins. We're going to discuss the necessity of knowing your character and how that knowledge can contribute to building a voice on the page. Barbara Baig's essay in Writing Voice is called Writing to Readers, and you should probably read the whole thing. In that essay, she says, "A writer's voice does have power. After all, that voice has to carry meaning from a writer's mind into the minds of readers. But power doesn't necessarily come from authenticity. It comes from authority. A writer's voice needs to sound not authentic, but authoritative. It needs to have a sound in it that indicates that the writer knows what she is talking about. And how do we get that sound into our writing voice? By getting to know our subjects as well as possible, and by being clear in what we have to say about them. Strengthen your writer's powers. Collect and develop your material. These activities will bring the quality of authority into your writing voice." The advice is age-old, and we've all heard it at least 1,000,000 times. Write what you know. That advice is applicable to many facets of fiction writing, of course, but it also applies to the creation of a unique voice for a first-person narrator. If we're going to listen to Baig's advice, and we should because it's great advice, we need to know our subjects. Most of the time, writers come to know things through research. And the good news is that researching a character doesn't necessarily mean you have to sit alone in a dark room and pore over scholarly articles. You can eavesdrop, You can even pay attention to the people close to you and see if they have habits, mannerisms, or manners of speaking that may be helpful to you. For example, while it is not advisable to model a character entirely after your great Aunt Agnes, who has this funny way of moving her hands and says, "Oh my word," in the most flabbergasted tone you've ever heard, nor to model a character exactly in the image of your very own Uncle James, who looks at the floor and whispers "fiddlesticks." Perhaps it is interesting if your character, we'll call her Jamie Agnes, flutters her hands, looks at the floor, and whispers, "Oh my fiddlesticks," in a flabbergasted tone. Jamie Agnes begins to form not from one source of observation, but from many. You can then begin to build a backstory for your character in your mind. In keeping with our previous, obviously silly example of Jamie Agnes, let's imagine she says, "Oh my fiddlesticks," because she picked it up from her grandmother, who died when she was 9. And in repeating the phrase, she feels closer to that grandmother. Whether or not Jamie Agnes's backstory makes it to the page, thinking about such things can only increase your knowledge of the character and therefore lend authority to your voice. Barbara Begg concludes the section of her essay on developing confidence with the advice, "When you have that authoritative quality in your writing voice, readers will trust you." She says, even if you are writing fiction, readers still need to know that you know your material, the world and the characters that you have invented. So perhaps "write what you know" is a piece of advice that we should not let fall on deaf ears. If we know our characters, we can write them with authority, and readers will believe that we know what we're talking about. Number 3, know your heroes, but don't become them. One theme that appears over and over again in both Anne Lamott's discussion of voice in Bird by Bird and a whole bunch of the essays in Writing Voice is the theme of new writers mimicking the voices of their favorite writers. In my own undergraduate workshops, people frequently said to me, "Do you know Dorothy Allison's work? Have you read Bastard Out of Carolina? It seems like you'd really like that book." I did not know Dorothy Allison's work, and I had not read Bastard Out of Carolina, but after the 5th person, yes, literally the 5th person, suggested that I read Allison, and especially Bastard Out of Carolina, I did read it. I absolutely loved it. From "I've been called Bone my whole life, but my name's Ruth Ann," to "I wrapped my fingers in rayleans and watched the night close in around us," I was riveted. Then I read Allison's short story collection, Trash. On page 11, I came to some words that I still have memorized to this day. Jessie used to say, "You've got such a fascination with violence. You've got so many terrible stories." She said it with her smooth mouth, that chin nobody ever slapped, and I love that chin. But when Jessie said that, my hands shook, and I wanted nothing so much as to tell her terrible stories. I thought, yes, Dorothy Allison, I want to tell terrible stories too. My second thought was, oh no, if I am writing themes similar to what Dorothy Allison has already done much better, and we are even writing in a similar dialect, I am going to fail. If the essayists in writing about emulating famous authors in writing voice are right, and their combined centuries of experience in teaching and writing can be trusted, I am not alone in that experience of worrying about copying my heroes. Fear not, writers, there's some advice on this matter too. Jordan Rosenfeld's essay in Writing Voice called Awaken Your Authenticity says, trying to force yourself into another person's voice is not only nearly impossible, unless you're an expert mimic, it's tantamount to tossing away your own personal style and individuality. Better to learn to become aware of and familiar with the language you use. What Rosenfeld is talking about here is your own personal lexicon, the words you know. She says, if you feel you'd like to stretch your vocabulary, there are easy ways to do this, but instead I recommend getting to know yours as though it's a language you're learning for the first time. Rosenfeld isn't arguing that you shouldn't read the masters. She's saying that while you're learning from them, you should learn your own lexicon too. You should try to think about your own voice down to the level of the very words you use. This idea of examining your own lexicon can be useful to the creation of your character's voice as well. You can ask yourself if your character would know a particular word, and if, after examination, you can't think of why your character, who has dropped out of high school to go to work at the Dixie Cup plant, would have a lot of experience with or use for the word anti-disestablishmentarianism, perhaps you should rethink that voice. However, this thinking about how words arrived in your character's personal lexicon may prove to be a new way of thinking about your character as well. After all, it's entirely possible that a high school dropout who works at a cup factory may have an obsession with 19th century British history. We'll leave this section with something Neil Gaiman said on the Nerdist podcast. He says, "Tell your story. Don't try and tell the stories that other people can tell, because as a starting writer, you always start out with other people's voices. You've been reading other people for years. But as quickly as you can, start telling the stories that only you can tell, because there will always be better writers than you. There will always be smarter writers than you. But you are the only you." Number 4, write to an audience. We're going to return to Barbara Begg's essay in Writing Voice, this time to her section called Practice Writing to Readers. One of the first things Begg says in this section of the essay is, whether you share your words with live human beings or not, practicing writing to someone will naturally bring your words the energy and aliveness of voice. Though she does not call it code switching, she does discuss how people, yes, even you, use different voices in their daily lives depending on who they're talking to. Since we're thinking about characters here, a good way to get to voice through thinking of audience is to think about to whom your character would be telling her story. Is he talking to a friend? Is she defending herself to an enemy? Does your character think the person hearing their story will be on their side? Begg has 3 questions writers can ask to help hone the voice of a narrator. Who is speaking? To whom? For what purpose? These 3 questions work well in helping to give the writer an imagined reader and allowing the imagined reader to help characterize the narrator. For at the very heart of these 3 questions, they all 3 go back to who your character is. A first-person narrator is often telling their own story, and surely they can imagine an audience when they do so. In Cormac McCarthy's Child of God, there are short first-person sections included in between sections of the main narrative. Though the main narrative, the story of Lester Ballard, is told in third person, the short sections have the people of his community relaying information about him. As I read the novel, I came to think of these speakers as sort of disembodied voices from whom different aspects of secondary characterization could be gleaned. Let's look at an example. On page 9 of the novel, there's a paragraph set off by itself directly following a scene. It says, "Lester Ballard never could hold his head right after that. It must have throwed out his neck some way or another. I didn't see Buster hit him, but I saw him laying on the ground. I was with the sheriff. He was laying flat on the ground, looking up at everybody with his eyes crossed and this awful pump knot on his head. He just laid there, and he was bleeding at the ears. Buster was still standing there holding the axe. They took him on in the county car, and CB went on with the auction like nothing had ever happened. But he did say that it cost some folks not to bid that otherwise would have, which may have been what Lester set out at. I don't know. John Greer was up from Granger County. Not saying nothing against him, but he was." There are several things to notice in that brief passage, one of which being the use of dialect. To me, this character, who did nothing but recount a story, came to life immediately because of the dialect. I'm from the Arkansas Ozarks, and I imagined a figure shaped roughly like one of my great-uncles. But we're not talking about dialect yet. Another aspect of McCarthy's mastery in including these speakers amid the pages of the third-person narrative is that the reader can imagine that the first-person narrator has an audience they are speaking to. Writing with an audience in mind can lend a sense of specificity to the voice of a character. You can listen to a character who, because they perform no action and are not described, have effectively not even been given bodies, and imagine that they are either sitting on a porch or at a kitchen table speaking to an inquisitive stranger. I obviously don't know what Cormac McCarthy had in his head when he wrote these passages, but I'd venture a guess, only from the resulting authority, authenticity, strength, and power of their voices, that McCarthy had an imagined listener on the other side of these narrators, sitting across from them at a kitchen table. To return to Humbert Humbert of Lolita, he is imagining you, the reader, as his audience. This unreliable narrator is trying to tell you his story because he believes you will acquit him. Bone, of Allison's Bastard Out of Carolina, imagines the reader of her story as someone before whom she can stand without the shame of poverty and abuse, someone with whom she can be unflinchingly honest about her truth. The disembodied voices of Cormac McCarthy's Child of God are telling the story of the town and the serial killer who lived there as if they are speaking to someone who asked about the events after they came to light. Each of these three writers has chosen an audience they can imagine their first-person characters opening up to, and then framed that story with the audience in mind. The careful selection of details is part of how people tell stories. It's how writers tell stories. And it's how characters tell stories too. As you are writing from your narrator's point of view, think about who the narrator would be comfortable enough to tell their truth to, and which details the narrator would select for that particular audience. So yes, ask yourself Beg's questions. Who is speaking? To whom? For what purpose? I'd also like to add a few more questions to further explore this idea. How comfortable is your narrator with that audience, and how trustworthy are they? Which details would your narrator select to tell his story? How intimate is the relationship your character has to their imagined reader? And, because sometimes cliches are useful, what does your character want to result from this telling of her story? Number 5. Use devices and use them well. Don Fry's essay in Writing Voice is called Creating Your Own Voice, and it's another essay that you should track down and read in its entirety. If you'll remember from the introduction to this lecture, Don Fry is the guy who said, "Voice is a collection of devices used consistently to create the illusion of a person speaking through the text." There is actually much, much more to his essay than just this idea of voice as a set of devices. But Fry has developed such a fantastic list of devices that I'd be remiss to leave them out of this lecture. First, Fry lists levels of diction, which he breaks down into 3 levels of language: high, medium, and low. His 3 examples of these levels of diction are both useful and hilarious, so they might be a good way for you to keep them straight. The 3 sentences are, "You're reading medium-level diction now." For low diction, he says, "This the way folks talk." For high diction, he offers, "Readers would experience the diction embodying this document as appropriate to the discourse community of educated middle-class speech." After that high diction sentence, Fry adds a parenthetical, "Okay, that's a parody." But let's pause there for a moment and consider how easy it would be to make both low diction and high diction read as parodies of themselves. Unless you are actively writing a parody, having your character's voice read as a parody is probably the furthest possible thing from what you'd want. However, not everyone in the world uses medium-level diction all the time, nor should every character. So, how do you avoid the potential catastrophe of writing with high or low diction? Don Fry doesn't offer much advice on this front, but I have 2 ideas for what you could do. First, read your work out loud to see if it sounds ridiculous. And get inside your character's head so intimately that instead of mimicking the voice you're constructing, you're writing that voice with authority. The second device Fry mentions is unusual language, an umbrella under which he places slang, dialect, and archaic word choice. His advice on unusual language overall appears to be that if you have to use them, use very little. As a rural Southern person, and as a writer of rural Southern fiction, I would suggest that you use unusual language as often as it seems authentic, as long as it doesn't sound ridiculous or condescending when you read it out loud. As for myself, I try to use dialect in as careful and thoughtful an attitude as if I were painting with the feathers of hummingbirds. Fry moves on from unusual language to formality of grammar and usage, in which he mentions that your formality should remain consistent throughout your story. We don't actually have the time during this lecture to dissect all the devices Fry suggests, so I'm going to list the rest of them. If you're taking notes, you're going to want to crack your knuckles and bear down, as there are several devices on this list. The fourth device in Fry's list is punctuation, followed by sentence clarity, sentence length and varied length, dependent clauses at the beginning of sentences, insertions, repetition of words, phrases and imagery, parallel structures, active, passive, and linking verbs, contractions, economy of wording, rhythm and flow, abstract and specific details, person and tense, confidence and assurance, sophistication of reference and explanation, areas of reference, name dropping, echoes, especially of standard works, imagery, wit and humor, point of view, and zest. I suppose if you were really struggling with voice, you could take these 25 or so devices Don Fry has offered you and make them into a list of questions you could ask yourself about each of your narrators. I myself have some fear that that level of pre-thought may cause you to overthink your character's voice and become intimidated before you begin, so perhaps this list of devices, like dialect, should be used very carefully and thoughtfully. We've covered 5 things in this lecture that may help you develop a compelling voice for your first-person narrator. Let's recap these 5 things so we don't forget what we learned. Number 1, know thyself. We talked about Lamott's assertion that writers are supposed to look at previously unexplored places in themselves, and Gabriela Pereira's idea that you don't really need to find a voice because you already have one. Number 2, know thy character. Here we discussed Barbara Begg's idea that writers should be seeking authority through voice, not so much authenticity, but an authoritative voice that readers can believe in, no matter the subject. Number 3, know your heroes, but don't become them. I briefly discussed my own hero, Dorothy Allison, and we talked about Jordan Rosenfeld's idea of the personal lexicon, relearning the language we use daily as if it is a new language. We also touched on ways to think about your character's personal lexicon. Number 4, write to an audience. Here we return to Barbara Begg, using her idea of writing to an audience to think about writers who appear to have used this method of building a voice for a first-person narrator. This is when we talked about Cormac McCarthy's Child of God. Number 5, use devices and use them well. Finally, we looked at a list of devices Don Fry put together for his essay in Writing Voice. We went deeper than the surface on his ideas about levels of diction and what he calls unusual language, but we didn't have time to cover all 25 devices, so the rest became a list. Hopefully you found some tools you can use the next time you want to build a voice for a character your readers will follow through any narrative. Happy writing, and remember, no one can read your first draft unless you show it to them, so it's okay to get messy. I'm Jessica B. Weisenfels. Thank you for sitting through this lecture with me.